Welcome. Our presentation today will focus on how we arrived at our research question. How has the Old Market Street sugar refinery adapted to Bristol's needs through time? Through many mediums of research, from sifting through historical records to exploring locations in person, we found the journey to arrive at this inquiry was both challenging and intriguing. This is our process of thought.
Our rabbit hole began with learning about forced labour in Bristol during a seminar session at the beginning of term. We became interested in the impact of the triangular slave trade between Britain, West Africa and the Caribbean, and the importation of valuable raw materials from the Americas. Bristol would carry goods to Africa, exchange them for enslaved people, transport, and the enslaved individuals to the West Indies, where they would be traded for sugar and other commodities. The ships would then return to Bristol with the goods, and this process became a crucial element in the triangular trade route.
We looked into key players in Bristol's history of trade, notably from our lecturers, John Pinney, who had a significant role in the slave trade in and out of Bristol, spending most of his life in the city. One activity involved looking into ship cargo records from the 1700s and 1800s. Here we noticed the presence of sugarcane quite frequently, and so became interested in the part it played in the industry of Bristol during this time. This led us to look into men involved in the sugar trade, perhaps most prominently George Burge, a Quaker and sugar refiner in Bristol. While there is little evidence for the life of Mr. Burge, it did inspire us to look further into the industry and business of sugar refining in the city of Bristol.
We decided to return and evidence more of the history of the Old Market sugar mill, achieving this primarily through journal evidence. The discoveries that we made furthered our inquiry by making us question what it was that meant the function of the buildings changed. This shaped our question in wondering how the building adapted rather than what changed. Between 1653 and 1783, Bristol imported sugar from the West Indies because the islands such as Barbados and Jamaica became major centres of sugar production during the colonial period. As a result of this increase in sugar from the West Indies, by 1760, 20 refineries had been established. Finally, there was an intense competition between Bristol, London and Liverpool, as all three cities had major ports. All three cities had extensive colonial links. However, ports in London had the greatest advantage, as they had the most effective global trade. The competition was most apparent due to the economic growth opportunities regarding sugar trade.
The transatlantic triangular trade, otherwise known as the exchange and transport of goods and people between Britain, the West Indies and Africa. Linking to our field trip research, we saw that the Old Market Street sugar refinery building itself contained the famous slogan, Virtute et Industria, meaning virtue and industry, a key slogan for Bristol's industrial past, which is still stamped all around the city to this day. This shows that while the building itself may have changed and the purpose may have changed, there is still a homage and recognition to Bristol's dark past, particularly in the sugar industry within Bristol.
Place is an integral part of understanding and properly answering the questions relating to anywhere in particular. Therefore, it is important for us to properly define at the beginning of the presentation the concept of place. The Dictionary of Human Geography states that place is a locus of individual and group identity, a fixed point on the Earth's surface, and the scale of everyday life. We can therefore analyse changes in place by looking at how each of these factors change, most importantly, identity and scale of everyday life.
This led us to our next node of inquiry, the Old Market Street sugar mill. Firstly, we looked into how the mill ran and the scale of its operations, online sources and journals which will be explored in later depth. While we found it hard to find evidence of slaves working in the Old Market Street refinery, we do know that slaves worked in the Lewis Mead refinery, particularly when it was used for making whiskey. Initially, the Old Market Street sugar refinery was one large establishment purely for the production of sugar. However, in 1860, parts of the sugar refinery were converted into drill halls by Rifle Corps.
We then decided to look into the history of usage of the Old Market Street mill via the use of mapping tools. Most prominently, DataShine and Know Your Place. DataShine, the top tool on this slide, demonstrated to us the current state of the mill. We chose a colour scheme that went pale with the lack of presence of industry, allowing us to clearly see the lack of industry in the Old Market Street area. The sugar mill itself was located on the south side of the crossroads to the east of the roundabout in the image. Know Your Place was also very useful to us, becoming more acquainted with the history of Old Market Street mill. By using the first edition OS map 1844 to 1888, we were able to evidence the presence of the sugar mill at the time where it would have been nearing peak production. We used the tool to also compare the region to a map taken in 2019 of the city on the left, where we can see evidence through naming of not only the refinery, but also the drill hall. By continuing to use the tool, we were able to identify that the building had many uses throughout history, from a refinery in the early to mid-19th century to a drill hall in the late 1800s. See the Loxton drawing from 1861 on the left of this slide. It was also used as a headquarters for the Gloucester Regiment at the beginning of the First World War on the right. This meant we became increasingly interested in the use of the refinery throughout time in Bristol, heading up our question.
In our field class, we hope to get an idea for what the building is used for today. We achieved this when we visited the site, evidencing that the building is now used as residential flats available to rent or buy. Some research on the go allowed us to find the price of one of the bedroom apartments at $245,000. We also noted on our field class the crest reading, Virtude est Industria, a remnant of the building's industrial past.
Here we are demonstrating and exploring Old Market Street's evolutionary process of use. As you can see, the Old Market Street has been utilised for multiple and varying agendas. Firstly, the sugar refinery was established in 1684 by the Rogers family. However, throughout the operation of the sugar refinery, it did acquire multiple management and ownership during its lifeline, as well as multiple interferences and shuttings. One example is in 1704, when the fires completely gutted the refinery. Initially, the Old Market Street Sugar Refinery was one large establishment purely for the production of sugar. However, in 1860, parts of the sugar refinery was converted into drill halls by Rifle Corps. In 1915, the Old Market Street was converted into a war office in order to aid the operations of the war, and was in use until the end of World War II in 1945. It has not been made apparent yet, but since the closure of the War Office in 1945, sometime after the Old Market Street was converted for residential use, which is still in operation today. Therefore, we can see that Old Market Street has been a very moulding and adapting infrastructure throughout generations, depending to the demands of the city or the nation, in order to benefit Bristol's economic, social, or political status.
It is important to understand the history of specific places, and therefore important to ask research questions around them and about how they develop. In modern-day Bristol, people are increasingly thinking about Bristol's past with the slave trade. We saw this in the video of the Colston Memorial toppling we viewed in class. To further this, modern slavery still does exist in Bristol, and so it is worth understanding to what extent is Bristol running away from its past, the fruits of slave labour, and which are still being developed in some industries, such as the Presti ice cream van industry, something ominously close to the industry of the sugar trade near 200 years ago. Therefore, information surrounding this is becoming increasingly important and worth asking, decolonialising aspects of Bristol.
To outline our line of inquiry, we have selected node points where our inquiry changed direction or gained depth and clarity. So, to summarise, we first became interested in forced labour and its relationship to Bristol. This led us to the sugar trade and triangular trade and individuals involved in the city. We looked into places in Bristol this manifested itself, namely the Old Market Street refinery. We became interested in the refinery, looking into its history and modern use. This led us to what changed in the refinery throughout time. Further research allowed us to refine this question to how the building adapted to change in Bristol.
Therefore, our research question asks how the refinery adapted rather than what change occurred in order to understand Bristol's role as a city in the timeline of its buildings. This is especially prevalent today as people are increasingly looking at Bristol's history in order to create a more equal image of the city.
This is how we arrived at our inquiry question. How has the Old Market Street Sugar Refinery adapted to Bristol's needs through time? Thank you for your time.